Okay, in this lecture, we are going to give a brief overview of cells. We're going to talk about cells a lot more throughout this course. So this is just meant to be an introduction to the different types of cells and some of the organelles that we'll see over and over again. And we'll look in more detail about the processes that happen in these different organelles. So this is really just meant to be an introduction to the different types of cells. So the definition of a cell is it's the smallest unit of life. So the smallest living thing would be a cell. Cells are made up of all different types of macromolecules, but the smallest unit of living thing is a cell. All living things are made up of cells. We'll see when we talk a little bit about viruses later about how some people will debate if a virus is a living thing or not, because viruses are not made up of cells. Viruses are able to use energy, and they're able to reproduce using a host, and they're able to do all kinds of things. So some people will put viruses in the living category, and some people will not because of this definition that to be a living thing, you have to be made up of cells, and viruses are not made up of cells. And all cells come from pre-existing cells. So we're going to talk about this a little bit in this lecture and then much more later. So here you can see the average yeast cell compared to a virus, which is just that little tiny dot, and then the cell of a bacteria. So a yeast cell would be a eukaryotic cell, and then a E. coli cell would be a prokaryotic cell. So we're going to talk about some of these different differentiations later. Just here, we're just seeing these sizes, and these are in micrometers. Micro is 10 to the negative 6 meters, so very, very small. So fundamental components for cells are cytoplasm. Sometimes you see this called cytosol. The difference between cytoplasm and cytosol, not really important. You'll kind of see them used interchangeably. They have at least one chromosome, which contains the genetic material. We're going to talk about genetics later. We'll talk about how many chromosomes different organisms have. Ribosomes, these are the organelles where we make proteins. Protein synthesis happens on a ribosome. We'll talk about plasma membranes and cytoplasmic membranes. Remember, in a previous lecture, we talked about a special type of lipid called a phospholipid, and these phospholipids are what make up these membranes. And the membranes are really important to separate different compartments in the cell. And one thing that we'll find as we talk about biology and living things is that the more compartmentalized, the more complex an organism is. So the more ability it has to be broken up into different compartments so that different compartments have different jobs, those types of cells are more complex than cells that don't have a lot of compartments. So this is a picture of a bacterial cell, and we'll use another word for this later, prokaryotic. So bacteria are prokaryotic. You'll see that it has all of these things in there. It has a chromosome. This is where the DNA is. It has ribosomes, cytoplasm, a cell membrane. It has all kinds of different things. But the one thing that differentiates a bacteria or a prokaryotic cell from a eukaryotic cell, like a plant or an animal cell, is that while it has DNA in the chromosome, the DNA in a bacteria or a prokaryotic cell is not membrane bound in a nucleus. It's just in the cell. In a plant cell, so a plant cell is an example of a eukaryotic cell. That chromosome or all of that genetic material is found in the nucleus. So we're going to see the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic is that prokaryotic cells do not have a membrane-bound nucleus, and eukaryotic cells do have a membrane-bound nucleus. So this is a much more specialized, compartmentalized cell in a plant. We're going to talk about a lot of this later, especially when we talk about photosynthesis and how plants make energy and more things like that. Again, what I just said was that a prokaryotic cell has no nucleus or compartments. This is bacteria or archaea. And eukaryotic cells do have a membrane-bound nucleus and compartments. So examples of this would be protists, animals, plants. One of the theories about how cells became more compartmentalized is this endosymbiotic theory, where one cell engulfs another, and then it results on dependence, this resulting in dependence on each other for survival. So this would be like between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell. Again, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but this is showing that endosymbiotic process where one cell engulfs another, and then that is just passed on for generations. Here's the evidence for that. It seems that a mitochondria or a chloroplast, so a mitochondria in a animal cell or a chloroplast in a plant cell, these are the organelles where the majority of the energy is made. And these mitochondria and chloroplasts have circular DNA and appear very similar to ancient DNA from bacteria. And they're also double membraned, which is unique for an organelle. So when we talked about the classes of macromolecules, we said one of the classes was a phospholipid, and the phospholipids are involved in the lipid bilayer. So these are the membranes. So not only of the cell, but also for the organelles that are going to be found in the cells. So it's called a lipid bilayer, bi meaning two, because there's two layers of lipids, and those two layers of lipids are what make up the membrane. So here are just some other examples of organelles. I have a nucleus. The purpose of the nucleus is to protect the DNA. So the DNA is information. We want to make sure we keep it safe. It doesn't get damaged. And in the nucleus, it's very protected. In and out of the nucleus, so the DNA isn't damaged. We have what's called the endoplasmic reticulum. There's two types of endoplasmic reticulum, but the rough endoplasmic reticulum is where the ribosomes are found. Ribosomes are important in protein synthesis. And then we also have another organelle called the Golgi body or a Golgi apparatus. And the Golgi apparatus is kind of like the shipping center of the cell, where proteins or lipids or carbohydrates are made, go to the Golgi apparatus, and the Golgi apparatus sends them to where they belong. Okay, so we'll talk in much more detail later about ATP synthesis and cellular respiration, which is the process by which our body breaks apart sugar, glucose, into a molecule called ATP. And ATP is the molecule that our cells, it's like the currency for energy in our cells. So it's how we make energy. It's how we convert the energy in the bonds of the glucose in the food that we eat into the bonds of the ATP molecule that then we can use to power unfavorable chemical reactions. So we're going to get to all of this later, but you've probably heard before, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, meaning this is where we make all of the energy. And we're not really making energy, we're converting energy from the energy in the chemical bonds of the fuel, like glucose, into the chemical bonds of the ATP. So we're going to cover all of that later. Similarly, or kind of oppositely, plants do this in chloroplasts, but instead of using fuel from the food that they eat, they use fuel from light from the sun. And this happens in the chloroplasts, and we'll cover this when we talk about photosynthesis. But this is an organelle in a plant cell called a chloroplast. We're going to talk about the specific role of many of these organelles in plant cells. Plants have a cell wall. Animal cells do not. Plant cells have chloroplasts. So here in the blue, these two structures are unique just to plant cells. The rest are found in both plants and animals. So we'll talk about each of these more later as we start to look at different specialized types of cells. So plant cells have cell walls and chloroplasts. Animal cells do not. They have all of the other organelles, but they do not have cell walls. They have cell membranes, and they do not have chloroplasts. They have mitochondria. So this is a bacterial cell, so it's much less complicated, much less compartmentalized. It does have DNA and it has all of the different components, but they are not membrane bound. So they're all just kind of floating around in there in the cytoplasm. And we're going to spend a lot more time in this course looking at the similarities and differences in the different types of organization of different cells as we move through some of these different parts of biology.